1619 project. I hope that you all got a chance to read the prelude, the whatever that was, the preface.
Okay.
Because she does a great job outlining exactly what it is that she's doing. I hope that as you read through that, you had some itchy parts, right? The things that kind of made you scrunch up a little bit, that made you a little uncomfortable. Because the problem is that in Black-white relations in America, we, the majority race, has too easily taken in the simple route. And we have to go against some of our instincts in doing that. Let me pin my other self so you can see what the background is over there. Oops, thought I did it. Don't you love that? Remember the picture like this of the little black girl being brought into segregated classrooms, protected, needing to be protected. And I feel like people like DeSantis and others are trying to protect us from something from which we should not be protected. We should be eager to step towards learning about Black history, because too often what we've done is kept ourselves safe from all of that because it was simpler, because it was easier for us as in our space of privilege to not have to deal with that. And yet, bottom line is, dealing with it is a good thing. It's as if we're afraid that in taking in truth, we will somehow be hurt by it. But I love what she says at the end of this chapter, where she says, if we are a truly great nation, the truth cannot destroy us. And doesn't it feel like that's sometimes what people are saying? Don't teach me that. Don't do that to me, because that will somehow hurt me, destroy me. Black Americans have been here. I love the name of the book. We often start American history with the date 1620, when the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock. I love that she found the date 1619. How many haven't heard of that date until just recently? And yet it predates what we often take as our earliest history. We know that, like, for example, Jamestown was founded before the Mayflower landed in, what, 1609 or whatever. We know that St. Augustine down in Florida was founded before that. But we often start our history at that 1620 date. And what she's saying is that a major part of our history predates that which we call the first of us. And that when that ship, the White Lion, landed at near Jamestown, we began a different part of our history. And can we be honest and appreciative of that larger history? It's not always easy to do that, because some of what it means is that our ancestors did something, were something that maybe we're not completely proud of. But that taking on of that shame, taking on of that challenge will make it so that we move forward in a better way. The denying of all that makes it so we continue to hide things, and hidden spaces never help us. So I want you to start with a little bit of your history, good or bad. Don't take long. There's not many of us, but tell us just a little bit about where race has played a role. I'll start. The first time I remember race is in junior high, and my school was mostly white. We did have an exchange student called Moramar, who was a friend of mine. His father was a student at the university in town, and so he was a friend of mine. So that extended my world beyond little Fort Collins, Colorado. but black, white, I remember two black kids in the whole school, Regina, who was a grade below me, and Roger T. Smedley, who was on my mile relay team. And so Roger and I knew each other well, but not well enough that I said, what's it like for you to be in this school where everyone is not of your color? What experience did he have there that I didn't have? After ninth grade, I moved down to Beeville, Texas, A.C. Jones High School, and it was in South Texas, down below San Antonio, and very different space. The only Hispanic that I knew up in Fort Collins was a girl named Chris Espinosa, who was more white than I was, if you know what I mean. And suddenly I went to a town that was 50% Hispanic, 10% black, and my 40% white was a minority. And I was in a very different space than I'd ever been in before. And many of those Hispanics were kids that I ran with. So tell me a little bit about your history.
Well, I'll go. I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma, and it was very homogenous. I think it is almost probably 90% white Anglo-Saxon Protestant at that time. We thought Jews and Catholics were exotic. I don't even think there were any Mormons. If there were, I wasn't aware of it. And so there were no black people in my elementary school or my junior high, but I was raised during a time when, the 60s. I grew up during the 60s, and certainly, was exposed to the popular art and literature of the time, and became aware of it by the time I was in high school. I was surprised in high school to find that there were a handful of black children in my high school graduating class. And I did wonder at that time where they lived. I figured it out later, but I was like, wow, where did these people come from? And there certainly was a black section of town. And my town has about 30,000 people. So it's not really small, but it's relatively small. But what really made me, so I grew up, and certainly my parents had liberal ideas. They certainly did not teach us to be racist at home. So I grew up with those ideas, but I discovered profoundly my own inner racism when somewhere in my college years, when my sister married a black man and had a black child. And so that brought racism really home to me. And by that time I was living in Norman. I was going to the University of Oklahoma. And so I was in a bigger environment and a wider world, but I not only became aware of the prejudice around me, but I began to see it in myself. And that was shocking to me. So something I've struggled with since.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, certainly never knew that 1619, never heard of that until a few years ago when I heard about this project.
Yeah. That your experience of not knowing where the black children came from is not untypical because of a phenomenon called redlining, where cities, towns across the United States kind of mapped out where different people could live. Often it was the railroad track, and the ones not wanted lived on the other side of the railroad track. Right up in Glendale, where I taught for 9 years, that's what happened there. And so those kids had their school over there, had whatever their growing up was, but you were separated and kept safe from, right? So your experience is not untypical. Ron, how about you?
So actually, I was in kindergarten when my parents went to basically almost all African-American church in DC, because we lived in Silver Springs. And I don't actually remember any difference in the color, but I was very young. And then I can remember my parents taught the Methodist Youth Fellowship at St. James for the high school. And there was always a traditional talent show. And every year there was a sort of a blackface skit was always part of it. And Byron Haynes, I don't know if you know him, arranged to have the youth group from Pueblo Gardens come and talk.
Come on.
And it was that, and that's, I still remember that dialogue because I think it was really powerful. And that it stopped. And then I want to bring up just it's a lot of the thing is unconscious. Because I remember also Reader's Digest ran in 1968 an article about slavery reparations, and that was the beginning of the IRD. And so that brought a lot of uproar in the church, and we happen to have an African-American pastor there as well. He was associate pastor. So, and I have taught in Inglewood and other places, but I think a lot of it is the unlearning the unconscious beliefs, such as my mother would say, well, if the government would just be giving money to them, then it would be okay. And the hardest thing for my father, who once stood up, he left in Texas when we were camping, and the director said, we don't let any N-words stay here. And my father said, well, no, I won't stay here either. But then later in his life, he got all his misinformation from Fox, and he started to repeat some of the same tropes. So,
yeah, I'm glad you had that experience growing up, Ron. I'm glad that you had the ability to be able to see from expanded world. Like I said, up until 9th grade, I really didn't have that, and moving down to Texas made me a better person because it expanded me. So I'm glad you had that experience. Thank you. Melissa, I don't know if you're busy. Do you want to share?
Yeah, I'm here. I just was thinking about, like you, when I first grew up, I only had maybe there was just one Black kid that I went through elementary school with all the way through high school. And then I was pretty lucky, though. My parents, since they were in show business, we had they dealt with a lot of Black people, and there seemed to be no prejudice on that. But I remember one time I had an aunt, and Patricia will laugh at this too, who referred to them as chocolate drops. And I remember that baffled me, because I was like, what? I'd never heard of such a thing. But otherwise, I wasn't, I could say I was both really protected and also not, I was not shown any kind of prejudice towards that. So that was a good thing.
That helps a lot, doesn't it? The point that she makes is that we all suffer from the poor history we've been taught, and it's people like the person who said the thing about chocolate drops. She didn't think about it because that was just something that was passed on to her, and she essentially attempted to pass it on to you. And we all have to decide: do we hold on to the history, or do we, like the little girl in the meme, say that we don't want to be protected from? As soon as this book came out, some of the reaction was, we got to go protect. I love the story that she said real quickly about Tom Cotton, that immediately tried to pass a bill to protect our white children, so to speak. And that's not what he called it, but that was essentially it. We think we have to save certain things. Oh, I know what the bill was called: Saving American History Act. Oh, we don't have to save American history. We have to learn American history. And the problem is that we're more comfortable learning just this much, because then we think we know it. But history is so big, we can't know it all. And what this book is essentially doing, I love her subtitle where she says, "A New Origin Story." Right? Like I said, we start our origin story often at the Mayflower. Why not at Jamestown? We talk about Jamestown, but that's in some ways not where America started. And it sure isn't St. Augustine, even though that predates both. I'm guessing that St. Augustine is not our history because, well, that's Spanish history, not English history. But both of those are origin stories as well, aren't they? And what happened in both those colonies, both those not colonies, but both those settlements is part of what formed the United States as it is today. And that landing of the White Lion at near Jamestown started a whole different strand of story. It put Jamestown on a whole different trajectory than what Massachusetts was taking. And that happened at Jamestown went to Massachusetts as well. It's important for us to remember, because oftentimes the story we tell is the South were the bad slavers and the North weren't. And the reality is that every single state had slavery as an option during part of its history. Every single state. So there weren't some that were always on the good side and others that were always on the bad side. It was, this is part of our whole story, all of us. And if we don't step into that and realize that and live out that truth, then we live on less than a truth. So tell me about the pieces of this chapter that surprised you, angered you, shamed you. What was in here that caught your attention in one way or another?
Well, can I bring up this a little bit off topic, but one of the difficult things as a person is to accept the shadow, that part of me which I can't accept. And it's the same thing with a nation. And it's hard. I mean, it's hard to accept the convict leasing, all the stuff, just when the 2021 insurrection on January the 6th, people said this was a first. There were several incidents, and I know there's one in South Carolina in the 70s or 1870s, 1880s, where basically the decision of where the blacks were basically, who won the election were basically kicked out. And that the riot in Tulsa in 1921, all of that has a long history. And I think it's there. The problem is being able to have the courage to face our national shadow as well as our human shadow.
And I think that's a hugely important point, because it's so easy to blame it on someone or say, I wouldn't have made those choices. And maybe you wouldn't have, but we did, the nation did. And if we don't honestly deal with that, not in a way that says, well, we beat it back in the 1860s and then do a sigh of relief and say, now we don't have to fight that fight. Just these last 5 or 6 years have taught us that, because many of us that grew up most of our life, spent most of our life on the other side of 1965, which the author says that's the only time since 1965 that we've practiced a true democracy. And I think that's true, because that was when we said everyone gets the same civil rights. And so we stepped into a new way of being. But we took that date and we essentially made it into okay, there we solved it, now we don't have to think about it anymore. And 50 years later, we're sitting here going, oh, why haven't we thought about it? And we're paying the price of that, not continuing the process of healing ourselves. And like you say, Ron, hiding that shadow side as if it didn't exist, because it continues to be there, right? What else caught your attention?
I think one of the things that really jumped out at me is the fact that how limited my experience of history has been. And, you know, in the first part where she talks about all the things that she's going to go into, and as I started to think about the history of slavery, which sounds like it should be a class, right? The history of slavery, because I mean, this country wasn't founded until 1776. So this is basically the first people coming here, which did not consider themselves American. They considered themselves Englishmen. And so this was being established by Englishmen, basically, maybe Dutch. I'm not sure how all of the different groups acted. I mean, maybe I'm going to find out during this book how the different groups that made up the first Americans. I've heard of the Quakers, so I know the Quakers were opposed to slavery, but it will be interesting to see how those people came from all these different places and ended up creating this country that was, I guess, in need of workers, I guess. That was the whole purpose. They came here to exploit the continent and had a lack of, even though they were probably encouraging many people to move here. I mean, I assume I'm going to find out in this book, but that's what my questions are as I started reading this, and I'm hoping that we'll get into that. I'm sure she will.
You know, the interesting thing about what you bring up is that the reason we made the choices we made around slavery is because economically it was profitable. And we wanted to be economically viable. And so we took those steps, we made those choices. And in many ways, because of those choices, we were able to have the resources to do to form a nation. But again, the shadow side says, are we dealing with the whole of what that meant? Hi, Al, how are you?
You're muted.
We
can't hear you.
yet. You're.
There we go. Good morning.
Welcome. Is it going to be just you, or is your wife coming too?
She's coming also. She's finishing breakfast.
All right, perfect. Well, we're just talking about the books and the book and what shocked you. So while we're waiting for her, let me show you some things back behind me over here. And if you want to borrow any of these books, you can. These are just different other books. This is Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. Just a marvelous book. And if you want to, it's also made into a movie that I think is available on Amazon Prime that you can watch there. Ibram Kendi, his book is just an incredible book about how to be an anti-racist. Absolutely an essential read if you get a chance to do that. I also have another one by Ibram Kendi. This one I haven't read. It's his newest one. It's called 400 Souls. The other book that's pretty essential to read is called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And that one deals with why is it that we don't do what Ron was asking us to do? Why is it we don't look at our shadow side? Well, because we're fragile and we're afraid that will break us. That's why Tom Cotton put in that bill. That's why much of the backlash to this book happened, is because our fragility tells us to protect ourselves rather than step forward. And then in the book, the author talks about how a certain book changed her life, and it was this book, Before the Mayflower, that tells the story that essentially they start from here, that 1619 happened way back when, and that maybe that was a space that could start us. Then Nancy Wilkinson she visited in the last couple of weeks, the the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture and brought back this little book with lots of different pictures of some of the artifacts that are there that tell the story, of that space. So if you'd like to borrow that, you're welcome to do that. You can get them in my office anytime. All right.
Thank you.
What else touched you? What else touched you? And by touched, I don't mean moved you in a wonderful way, because it might have been in a way that brought tears to your eyes. What else was difficult or good about this book for you?
I think something that struck me was the initial 1619, when those Africans were brought to North America on a pirate ship that had taken them from Portuguese ships, I believe. And they traded, whoever was there in North America traded food and supplies to the pirates for these people. And I'm wondering if the pirates were like some sort of threatening thing or what. And it just seemed like it set off a tone that I wouldn't have expected. It seems like right from the get-go, whoever bought these people didn't think anything of it. It just seemed like a normal thing to do.
Well, and that's because slavery was a well-known institution across the world at that time. Britain was still doing slaves. The reason it was a Portuguese ship was also because Brazil was already doing slaves. All right, so slaves were already a known quantity across the way, and so it was in Virginia a chance to be able to say, do we step into that same thing? Are we willing to make that pay that expense in order to get whatever we'll get from it? And they chose to say yes and step into that space. It's easy to do when you look at it from only one point of view. Most of our decisions that way have been made economically, or what's comfortable for me. And what she's asking us to do is to see the human quality of this. I want to talk about just a little bit about how she wrote this book. She is a scholar, and scholarly writings, let's say that this is what scholarly writings are like. Most of our history books that we have are written at a level down here somewhere, right? Giving us some of the facts, but not going deep into it. She has written this somewhere in the center between those two spaces, so that we have to step up our game from the easy history books that we've had, maybe not be complete scholars, but step into a space. And that means that, she says that most of what she's talking about isn't debated in scholarly circles. So when the backlash happened, the 1776 commissioned by President Trump, when that happened, it happened because they wanted us to move us back down to this easy level. And so they didn't ask any scholars. Did you notice that? They said, we're just going to act like this is the truth, whether or not it's the whole truth, instead of dealing honestly with this. It's easy. It's an easier way to do it. And all of us slip into that space simply if we let ourselves. And what she's asking us to do is to step way beyond that. So this isn't a conventional history that you might get in your school books. It is drawing us beyond that and moving us into a new origin story. Like I said earlier, we need to know those other origin stories. We tell our Mayflower story so we don't have to tell the story of the natives who they displaced in Massachusetts. We tell our story about plantations so we don't have to tell about the slaves that made those plantations work. Right? We tell grand and glorious founders of 1776, so we don't have to deal with some of the ways that maybe the British had right about what they were doing and how they were holding on to things. All those are part of the story, and we don't have to accept them as more important, but she says that there's a lot of origin stories and all of them should be told. And do we open ourselves up to that larger picture?
So I'd like to bring in a book called How the South Won the Civil War, with the subtitle Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Struggle for American Soul. It's by Heather Cox Richardson. And part of her take is, because she's dealing with the public as well, is to see that we're not rewriting history, we're broadening history, because history has always been a narrative. And the easy attack is, well, you're just trying to rewrite history, rather than we're bringing a broader spectrum of history. And then she brings up what she calls the American paradox, that when Jefferson, a slave owner, wrote, "All men are created equal," the corollary is some are more equal than other. And that tension between the ideal of all Americans created equal, but some are more than equal than others, has a history that runs through and we need to see both. It's a both and rather than an either or.
Yeah. I love the quote that she had by Frederick Douglass that said, "The story of the master never wants for narrators. Our job is to tell the story of the slave." And I think that story of the slave, which has been ignored in so many ways. I love the question that she asked of the people who worked with her on the original project, where she said, what are the things that are here in America today because they had a Black founder? And when we look at the Black experience in America and what we know of it, what are the things that are held, who are the people that are held up? It's a pretty small subset, isn't it? We will remember something like Frederick Douglass, George Washington Carver, Harriet Tubman. But we forget that a whole lot of what we consider everyday things were invented by Black people among us. And yet we don't tell that story, do we? And part of her point is that we have to open up to all that. That we need to celebrate all of that. One of the things that struck me from her story was where she talked about Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. I don't know if you know that book, but I remember when it first came out. And she's right that before that, the shelves in elementary schools were full of books with white kids in them. But there were not books of people of any other color. Any other color. And suddenly that book began to break the dam, and books began to flow in. And what's that say to a kid who is of a darker tone, that nobody in a book looks like them? And so I can understand how she clung to that book and read it over and over again, because suddenly there she found herself. She identified with someone in the story. And I look at my kids that I taught. For 9 years I taught mostly Hispanic kids, and there was not much in Hispanic that had Hispanic kids in a story. And so I searched for those kinds of things because they needed to hear themselves, see themselves. But you have to go beyond what's easy, right? What's been your development as you've gone past whatever you were given growing up? Al and Adrian, when we started, I had everyone tell a little bit about just their history. so if you'd like to do that, I'd love to have you do that. But then I want us to go past that and says, what are those things that are beginning to change you so that you have a better perspective on that? So let me turn to Al and Adrian first, if you'd like to. Would you like to tell us some of where you grew up from? What was your origin story?
For me, I grew up in Northern California, the north end of the Sacramento Valley. Some years later, when I was in the Air Force, I mentioned somebody who I was from, and he said, "Oh, you're a hillbilly." And I didn't think much about that, but looking back on it and being removed from that area now, looking back at my classmates and family members who have stayed there, they're quite parochial, quite insular from a lot of stuff. When I was in school, in high school, had a graduating class of about 400. There were only 2 Black kids in our group. And I remember one day, the boy came up to me. He needed some lunch money. His mother had passed away, and he needed some money for lunch, so I gave it to him. A couple of weeks later, he came up to me again, and his mother was very, very ill at that time. But that was my only exposure to Blacks until I went into the military. And there, you were not separated by race or color, creed, or anything like that. It was a number of stripes on your sleeve, or if you had some sort of medal on your collar. Much more egalitarian, I guess. I think that's the proper word for it. And over the years, I've looked and seen that I still see Black people differently than I see white people, or people like me, or people who are not Black. I see differently than Black people. It's not that I want to see them that way. It's just something that has happened to me. I find this book fascinating, thinking back on what we learned in school, what I learned in school about the revolution and all that. I didn't realize that slavery played such an important role in it. I have come to understand that it was, I've come to the point that I wonder what our country is all about. Are we really a great experiment in democracy, in human rights and so forth? Or are we a economic system, a monetary system? Do we exist? Is our Constitution built like the rules of playing Monopoly, rather than all of the nice words that sound like empowering people, lifting everybody up, and all of that? I think right now we're at kind of a crossroads in this country. We talk about exporting democracy around the world, and yet things like human rights, we seem to draw a line at our territorial boundary. I look back at what we did with people that we captured from ISIS. We couldn't handle them here in this country according to our rules, so we put them off on Cuba down there, Guantanamo, where we kind of made up rules that, if we were to apply them here, are absolutely terrible. And we rail against other countries doing that sort of thing to their citizens. Yeah. Yet we did it partly out of fear, I'm sure, but I don't know. So I guess what I'm saying is, over the years, I'm different from the people back home. I appreciate that. I've read Howard Zinn, and I can't remember the name of the book, but he goes beyond what we learned in school. What we learned in school was, yeah, it was pretty, it was nice, it was comfortable, I guess. We were noble and all that. And over the years, I'm seeing that, no, we weren't, but we have a possibility of doing things better. And I'll let Adrian talk now.
The good news, Al, is we can be both noble and not so noble at the same time.
A People's History of America by Howard Zinn.
Thank you. Thank you, Ron.
Go ahead,
I'm an Army brat, And so I was always brought up with the idea that, everybody was, excuse me, born equal. When I graduated from college, excuse me, let me get the door.
So while she's gone, let me just expand what I just said. The hard part is that something like the 1776 commission is trying to make it so that we only hold up the nobility of someone like George Washington and overlook the fact that he had slaves. And even though he promised them he would release them on their death, on his death, he never did that. Right. And so he kept the economics of that system going. And so did he do wonderful things? Yes. It doesn't mean that he's a perfect man. And that's what I think we sometimes try to hold up when we attempt to find exceptionalism, that there was something only divine about those people, not the human side that they are. Adrian, go ahead.
Oh, I went to the University of Texas, and we were trying to integrate the strip, the place where all the coffee shops and the cheap cafes and the theater house and the clothes shops and things like that. And what was interesting, it was been 2 years later, after I graduated, it was integrated. I mean, the university was integrated and also the strip. But what was interesting is that somehow or other, word got back, and my mother was the one who bore the brunt of my actions. I was the daughter, and I should not have done what I was doing. And I really loathed Texas. I loathed their segregation policy. When I was in graduate school, one of my colleagues there in the lab was a woman who had a baccalaureate from one of the Black colleges at that time. And I could not take her across the street to have a hamburger. I just couldn't. But the Black people there in Galveston would let the white people come to the jazz session that they had from 1 to 4 down at their little jazz place on the wharf. This was on the northern part of Galveston. And they let us come. It was sort of an unspoken thing. You left at 4 o'clock. And I thought how gracious that was. I mean, we wouldn't let them go for a hamburger, but they would let us come for wonderful, wonderful music. And I was so glad to leave that place. To me, Texas just embodies it. Maybe I know it's integrated now, but I really loathed and detested what I saw down there. And I thought it was kind of interesting. My mother knew more about what I was doing than I did, in a way. So
It's always a challenge trying to figure out how to do that. I want you to take some moments and think about all the ways that things began to change for you. I can tell you my moment. Maybe you've heard this story before. I've shared it before, but it happened in my junior year in high school. I was a runner, and running was my life. And my coach left our school district, went to another one. We got a new coach in, but he didn't start till the fall. And so the summer track program was at peril. And I needed the summer track program because I needed to be prepared, because we had a really good cross country team and I needed to not be out of shape. I needed my other teammates not to be out of shape. So we went around the city and we got kids to sign a petition to say, we want a summer track program. And I went to the city council in Beeville, Texas, that I remember I told you that it was 50% Hispanic, 40% white, and 10% Black. And I looked at the dais of the city council people, and there were 3 men sitting there, all white. And the 2 Hispanic councilmen were sitting on the front row protesting the fact that Hispanics were underrepresented because of the zoning of the city. And I looked along my row, and all my friends, Isaac, Jesse, Gonzalo, Gilbert, all those little Hispanic kids that I loved so well, that were my friends, that I ran with all the time. And I said, you see a different world than me. You live in a different space than I do. And it began to change how I viewed life, began to move me in ways that I wouldn't have gone if I'd stayed in my insular space. That's what I hope this book is for you. You've already done some of that work. I hope this continues that work. That moves us into better spaces. The author has her own way to be able to say that. If you have one of the books that I got, one of the large print editions, which I hope it was okay that I got the large print editions. I didn't mean to, but I think we can all benefit from it. It's on page XXX, page 30 of the preface, where she talks about bringing slavery and the contributions of Black Americans from the margin of the American story to the center. That actually starts on page 29. To the center where they belong, by arguing that slavery and its legacy have profoundly shaped modern American life. And then she goes through 4 questions. And I want to repeat these questions to you. What would it mean to reframe our understanding of US history by considering 1619 as our country's origin point, the seat of so much of what has made us unique? What if we look differently that direction? We think about a different way to be able to frame all of that. Second of all, it says, how might that reframing change how we understand the unique problems of the nation today? Its stark economic equality, its violence, its world-leading incarceration rates, its shocking segregation, its political divisions, its stingy safety net. How would that change? Because sometimes we've been insulated from all of that stuff, but not everyone in America has been. What if we began opening ourselves up to what that's the truth of that? The third question, how might it help us understand the country's best qualities developed over a centuries-long struggle for freedom, equality, and pluralism, a struggle whose DNA could also be traced to 1619? Is slavery part of what informs us on a regular basis, and we just don't acknowledge that? Not just the slavery itself, but the response of Americans to the slavery. Is that informing much of what goes on socially in our world today? And the fourth question is, how would looking at contemporary American life through this lens help us better appreciate the contributions of Black Americans, not only to our culture, but also to our democracy itself? Those 4 questions I want us to come back to often as we read through each of the sections. Through the next few weeks, what we'll do is we'll look at different ways that Black culture has influenced and affected America, right? The next week we start off into the first section, and it kind of does a broad sweep of democracy and how democracy was formed through the Black American experience, and how all of that contributed to in ways that were often hidden from us, in stories that we didn't tell. Because if we told stories of Black Americans, it was usually as a minor peripheral character. And she's gonna bring those peripheral characters into the center. I hope that it challenges you. I hope it draws you beyond the stories you've told before. Bring your questions, bring your struggles, bring it into this space so we deal with it together. That's what we don't want is we don't want to be some of the places that So for example, there was a book that I saw that came out immediately after 1619 called 1620. To having to reassert the first date instead of trying to hear what she was saying about the other date, the new date that she was looking at. Because 1619 doesn't supplant 1620, but some people have acted as if it did. Don't do that. Don't protect yourself from Black history. Move into that. Let it change you. Our exceptionalism that is often taught with the 1776 story isn't the only thing that's true about us as Americans and about our American history. Move into that larger history and let it form you. Any last thoughts before we go?
Yes, I'd just like to bring up first that we need to accept both. We need to embrace both our nation's goals, its ideals, and its shortfallings.
That's right.
And to hold those in tension because both are true. And then I still want to bring up, and I hope we explore, because this runs throughout history because both parties, in fact, all parties have used division and fear of the other to gain power, from the Southern Democrats and Jim Crow to the current Republican Party. And I hope that, but I think we have to be honest about that. And that the hardest, those who owned just one slave, those who were poor and actually didn't even have slaves who had to work, the poorest whites suffered not as much as the slaves, but they still suffered from the system. And I think we all suffer from the system. We have the highest maternal mortality rate. We had the highest childhood poverty rate. We pay twice as much for healthcare as every other industrial country. And all that comes from that idea of, if we invest in some people and better roads and better hospitals, then it's going to go to those people. And that strategy has run throughout our history.
Yeah. And that's what redlining was basically about. Redlining said,
Yes.
We'll put them inside of these boundaries. And then the second part that happened there is, and we won't give quite as much service to. Right? And so roads were not as developed there. Sidewalks were maybe not put in place, whatever it happened to be. And what if we step into, and the hard part is that we think that it means taking away from what I am. And I think they're very different things. I think it's about how do we, if I think this is the space that I should be in, why don't I allow each person, everybody, to be at that same space? Why don't I think that's the standard that's appropriate and right to expect for everyone? And for some reason we say, this is where I'm at, and so don't make me leave, even if you have to stay down here. It's not about us losing something, it's about other people being able to step into.
I think the thing about looking at 1619 versus 1776, we hear people in different events and whatnot shouting USA, USA, USA. Not quite sure what I think they mean by that. I'm not sure what I think of when I say USA. The other thing is this chant of "We're number one, we're number one." And as Ron was pointing out, there are a lot of things we're number one in that we should not be proud of. 1776, looking at that, looking at what we were perhaps taught years ago, that's an easy spot for some people who were even paying attention. I kind of divide people around me between those who were in the front of the class paying attention and the people in the back of the class who God knows what they were doing. I think 1776 is a comfort spot for a lot of people. That's what they know, that's what they're comfortable with, and they don't want to know anymore. There is a lot of dumbing down that's perhaps the country has had a lot of people who are too busy to be involved. They've not come from a very good educational background. And it's pleasant, it's pleasing to hear nice things about the country. The thing I take some pleasure in is looking at, I wasn't aware of just how involved slavery was in the initial development, the beginnings of this country, all of the concessions made to the southern states that were so blatantly involved in slavery. And I didn't realize how much the northern states were benefiting from that also. But it's comforting to see how we have evolved over the years. We're still not very good at it. We still have slavery in this country. Every once in a while, I see articles about slave labor as it's involved with our prison system.
Yes.
The prison industries, I think that's the title of this company or whatever. I remember when I was working, we had these shelters for weather instruments. You see them, the ones that have a thermometer in them and so forth, the white things up on stands. Over the years, those would get pretty well weather beaten and they have to be repainted. And the fellow in our office would take those down to Carson City, to the prison down there, put a carton of cigarettes in there. Somebody would grab those and paint it, and a week later he'd go down and pick up the painted thing. I look at the Civil War, which we'd like to think ended slavery in this country, and it didn't. I look at a lot of the poor whites who came back from fighting for that noble cause of the South, becoming sharecroppers, becoming basically slaves to the landowners. And I think we still have a lot of that going on.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Al. We'll get to all of those kinds of things. We have plenty of weeks to be able to talk about them all.
So catch the movie 13, it's on Netflix.
Now, the
Which deals
13th
with convict leasing and other issues, and then come to Adult Ed on March 26th, where we'll talk about prison reform and some of the issues that you were raising.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ron.
As we go through this book, step outside of your comfort. I think you're exactly right, Al, when you said that when we get comfortable, we get a smaller story. I don't think you said it that way, but that comfort is not a good thing for us. We need to move beyond comfort and into the larger story that will make us into better people. So don't be afraid of being uncomfortable. And in doing so, I think we'll change ourselves and change this nation. Thanks for being here with us.
Thank you.
Take care, my friend.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.